Hello, my name is Mary Andrade, and for my current events presentation, I'm going to be discussing digitization issues in museum archives. I'm going to be focusing on two main issues, which I will list on a later slide, and I will provide an example of each of these issues throughout this presentation as well. Okay, so in this presentation, I will be going over why museums digitize objects, and then the issues of the rights of materials and the loss of physical objects. To start, I'm going to go over some of the reasons for digitization and why museums digitize their collections, because I believe that's going to give us a good basis to get into the issues of digitization of museum archives that I will get into later in this presentation. So some of the reasons for digitization include preservation and protection of materials. Another is providing online access to content, which I think in the past year this has been especially important. Another is for promotion and commercialization, and lastly, for media consolidation. Now I'm going to define some of the terms that you come across when looking at the issue of rights of materials. So these terms are intellectual property, licensing, and copyright. To start, intellectual property is any work that is a result of creativity that someone has the rights to. Next is licensing, and that is granting permission for the use or release of a work. And then the last one is copyright, and copyright is the exclusive legal rights given to the creator or owner of a work, allowing for the printing and publishing of the work, and also the authorization for others to do the same. After defining terms, we can get into the issue of rights of materials, and we're going to be looking at museums through a pretty critical lens in this situation. So, when museums make additions to their collections, they typically have ownership over the items in their collections. In some cases, these items are considered to be public domain, which means that they are not owned by anyone and there is no need to obtain permission to use the works, but it also means that they are not subject to copyright law and other intellectual property laws. So this brings us to the issue where museums are creating contracts that give them a copyright type control over a work, limiting access to the public and what they can do with that public domain material. This is allowing museums to monopolize public domain works. Lastly, museums face issues with digitizing orphan works and out-of-print works due to copyright. So orphan works are copyrighted works in which the owners are unable to be located, and out-of-print works are works that are no longer being printed or distributed but still fall under copyright law. There is some legislation for if and how museum archives can digitize these materials, and this legislation includes limiting public access to the work. Now I want to get into an example of public domain and contract law. So this example comes from an article by Garvin. This example deals with the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and some of the claims that they make on their website. Under the website's terms of agreement, it mentions that all materials on the website are subject to copyright laws. However, there are some materials that can be used for fair use. This now gets confusing for users on the site because there are items on there that are under public domain, but they still fall under the contract by the Museum of Fine Arts. Another issue museum archives face with digitization is physical objects and loss. So this includes both the loss of the object itself and the loss of information when digitizing. Some people believe that once something has been digitized, the physical copy can be destroyed, and this can cause issues for a museum archive. I've actually experienced this at the museum that I work at. I work at a Firefighters Museum, and our collection holds materials from 39 stations. And the previous director of the museum had all of the photographs digitized and destroyed the original copies, and we no longer have access to the digital copies of these photographs. And when we have stations coming to us looking for pictures of their station, we're unable to provide them to them because we no longer have access to the digital copies and the physical copies no longer exist. Additionally, digital objects and physical objects are fragile. So they're fragile in different ways. So digital objects are fragile because if they're not properly saved in the correct format or properly stored, the files can become corrupt or no longer accessible. And that if the physical object no longer exists, you lose the object forever. And physical objects are fragile for different reasons, and it's part of the reason why they're being digitized for long-term preservation. In one of the articles I read regarding this topic, it said to keep physical objects once they've been digitized, and this can be an issue for some museum archives because of the limited physical space, which may be why they're digitizing the object in the first place. Now, if it is possible to have both a physical and digital copy, that would be the best for long-term preservation. But like I said before, that's not always the case. And if that's not the case and the digital copy is all that is being kept, it's important to be up to date on digital preservation and ways to keep this digital object for as long as possible, and making sure that it is available for future generations. So the last thing I want to go over when it comes to physical objects and loss in museum archives is the loss of information. And what I mean by loss of information is when you digitize a physical object, you lose some information that comes with that physical copy. And in some cases, this could be the context in which the original was in, or when it comes to photographs, it could be the quality of the photograph. You lose some quality, and then that could cause you to lose some information from what was in the photograph. To conclude, there are issues when it comes to digitization in museum archives. And as I said before, this can be on the museum's end when it comes to copyright and public domain and monopolizing public domain materials. It could also be the loss of physical objects and information when digitizing these objects. But there are benefits to digitization, and those benefits are the reasons as to why museums digitize. So, as I said previously, for preservation and protection, and to provide online access to the content in the materials in the museum's collection. Now, these issues have been around for many years, but they still remain a current issue, and they will continue to be an issue when it comes to digitization in museum archives. So when it comes to copyright and public domain, it's important to hold museums accountable for how they're holding their public domain materials, but this is also a legal issue and involves copyright law and contract law. So this will continue to be an issue. And when it comes to losing physical objects and information, it's important to keep up to date with digital preservation news and new technological advances to ensure that the digital objects can be kept for as long as possible and for future generations to access. And thank you for listening to my presentation.